Japanese pilots once believed the Zero reigned supreme, but everything changed when the American F6F Hellcat arrived. At first, it looked like just another brutish Wildcat, dismissed as heavy and slow. Then came the shocking reality: a fighter with a 2,000 horsepower engine, 6.50 caliber guns, thick armor, and self-sealing tanks. A carrier-borne brawler built to survive and overpower. Pilots reported slashing attacks they'd never seen, squadrons absorbing damage that would have downed any Zero. Fear began spreading in Japanese briefings long before the first clash. How did a machine born from defeat shatter a nation's air doctrine and leave legend broken in the sky? The answer starts in the Iron Works, where Grumman changed the rules of war. Inside Grumman's Iron Works, the old rules of fighter design were torn up and rewritten. The team started with raw power: the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a 2,000 horsepower radial that dwarfed anything the Zero could mount. Factory test logs clocked the Hellcat at nearly 380 miles per hour, outpacing the best Japanese interceptors by a full 15%. That engine wasn't just about speed. It could claw the Hellcat up to combat altitude in minutes, then push it into a steep dive or breakaway climb without hesitation. Engineers didn't stop at brute force. They wrapped the cockpit in steel armor plate, up to 3/4 of an inch thick, shielding the pilot from machine gun bursts and cannon shells alike. Self-sealing fuel tanks, a rarity on Japanese fighters, let the Hellcat shrug off hits that would turn a Zero into a fireball. Under the skin, heavy-gauge aluminum spars and reinforced bulkheads gave the F6F a reputation as a flying tank. Firepower came next. 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns lined the wings, each with a field of fire converging at 300 yards. Operational memos show Grumman's design team rejected mixed caliber setups for simplicity and reliability. Every trigger pull sent a wall of lead, enough to shred a lightly built Zero in a single pass. Carrier commanders demanded more than just muscle. The F6F came with hydraulic landing gear and folding wings, designed for the brutal tempo of Pacific carrier decks. Maintenance crews could swap engines or patch up battle damage in hours, not days. A fact logged in USS Enterprise and Essex records. Every line, every bolt, every choice served one purpose: let the pilot survive, strike hard, and return for another fight. In the hands of a determined crew, the Hellcat was more than a machine. It was a promise of control, resilience, and overwhelming force. Japanese pilots would soon learn the difference between a nimble duelist and a predator built to win wars. On the flight deck, speed and firepower meant nothing if a fighter couldn't survive the next mission. The Hellcat's armor was more than a technical boast, it was a lifeline. USS Enterprise maintenance logs from late 1943 show Hellcats returning with shredded wings, punctured fuel tanks, and even gaping holes behind the cockpit, yet most were back in the air within hours. Mechanics called it the flying tank because, unlike the Zero, a Hellcat could take punishment and still be patched up for the next sortie. Self-sealing tanks, stitched deep into the wings and fuselage, turned what should have been fatal hits into minor repairs. Whereas Zero's fuel would erupt in a flash, the Hellcat's tanks swelled, closed, and kept the fire at bay. Pilots who might have been lost to a single tracer round instead landed safely on the carrier deck, their aircraft leaking but alive. Carrier practicality ran deeper than brute protection. Grumman's engineers built the F6F for the chaos of Pacific operations: hydraulic gear that folded on command, wings that tucked tight for crowded hangars, and redundant control lines that let a damaged Hellcat limp home even with half its systems shot away. Deck crews could swap out an engine, patch bullet holes, and refuel in a single shift. Essex-class logs recorded turnaround times that stunned visiting officers. A Hellcat grounded at dawn could fly again by lunchtime. For the men below deck, every bolt and bracket was a promise to the pilots overhead: come back and you'll fly again tomorrow. The result was relentless pressure on Japanese squadrons. Not just a tougher plane, but a machine that multiplied its presence with every rapid repair, every safe landing, every sortie launched before the enemy could recover. The blueprint had become reality, and the Pacific skies would never be the same. August 1943, Pacific skies. VF-9 Hellcats sweep over Marcus Island for their combat debut. Japanese spotters, scanning the formation, jot down a familiar silhouette. To their eyes, this is just another Wildcat, maybe a heavier variant, certainly not a threat to seasoned Zero pilots. Intelligence officers label it the Wildcat 2 in their after-action logs, noting little reason for concern. But that confidence doesn't last long. The first dogfights bring a jarring surprise. Hellcats absorb cannon fire and keep flying, trailing smoke but refusing to fall. Reports from Tarawa and Marcus pile up. Zeros empty their guns, yet the blue American fighters slash through, guns blazing, then climb away untouched. Pilots describe the Hellcats' head-on attacks as reckless, almost suicidal, yet when the shooting stops, it's the Zeros that scatter or burn. Japanese squadron leaders, used to watching enemy wings snap or tanks erupt in flame, now see Hellcats limping home with holes punched clean through their fuselages. Mechanics examine wreckage and find spent .50 caliber rounds embedded deep in engine blocks, evidence of firepower that the Zero's thin frame can't match. By October, after a handful of sorties, the old assumptions are already cracking. Diaries and combat logs start to question whether this is just a Wildcat at all. The myth of Zero invincibility, so carefully built since 1941, begins to erode, replaced by a wary respect for this new, unyielding adversary. Squadron leaders didn't rely on luck or raw nerve. They drilled their pilots to fight by the book, never alone, never by instinct. The Hellcat's real weapon wasn't just firepower, but teamwork. In the air, pairs of F6Fs flew side by side, ready to cover each other. If a Zero latched onto one, the wingman snapped into a defensive turn, crossing behind and forcing the attacker to break off or take a burst of .50 caliber fire. This was the Thach Weave, a move born in the Wildcat days, perfected by Hellcat crews. VF-17's after-action reports detail how this simple pattern turned Japanese ambushes into traps for the hunters themselves. Altitude was the next advantage. Hellcat pilots climbed high, scanning for enemy formations below. When Zeros appeared, Americans dove in at full throttle, unleashing a slashing attack, boom and zoom. The goal wasn't to outturn the enemy, but to strike hard, then climb away before the Zeros could react. Japanese pilots, trained for swirling dogfights, found themselves outpaced and outgunned. Every engagement began on American terms, with Hellcats dictating when to fight and when to vanish into the clouds. On carrier decks, combat information centers vectored squadrons to intercepts, feeding real-time positions from radar and radio. The result was a playbook approach, pairs and flights working as a single unit, overwhelming isolated Zeros with coordinated attacks. Discipline and doctrine replaced the old duel. The Hellcat's design made it possible, but it was method and teamwork that made it deadly. Inside the cipher rooms of the US Pacific Fleet, intercepted Japanese signals began to tell a different story. Ultra decrypts, once filled with boasts about Zero victories, shifted to warnings. Avoid lone Hellcats at all costs. Intelligence officers pieced together fragments. Squadron leaders reporting attacks that came in disciplined pairs, never alone, and always from above or out of the sun. Captured memos from the Imperial Japanese Navy described the Hellcat as a shark pack, not a single predator, but a coordinated threat that circled, struck, and vanished before a counterattack could form. Prisoner interrogations revealed new orders circulating through Japanese air groups by late 1944. Pilots were told to shun isolated blue fighters, to wait for reinforcements before engaging, and above all, to avoid the classic turning duel. The phrase, "Do not pursue the Hellcat into a climb," appeared in more than one decoded message. Reports from Rabaul and Truk described the growing fear that any Hellcat spotted alone was only bait for a larger ambush. What began as tactical advice soon became doctrine: avoidance, hesitation, and a creeping sense of being hunted. In Tokyo, staff officers debated desperate countermeasures, but the evidence mounted. Hellcats were not just tougher, they were everywhere, and they fought as a single mind. The myth of the lone samurai gave way to the reality of the wolf pack. For Japanese aviators, the sky was no longer a place of glory, but a hunting ground where the hunter rarely wore their colors. Veteran Japanese pilots once soared into battle with the confidence of hunters. By late 1944, that certainty had vanished. Squadron diaries from Rabaul, Rabahul, and Truk describe a new ritual, scanning the sky for the dreaded blue silhouette, then circling away at the first sign of a lone Hellcat. The old urge to chase had withered, replaced by a silent calculation: survive, not score. In the words of one pilot, we were told to avoid the blue death. To fight was to vanish. Personal logbooks recount moments of panic, engines pushed to the limit, desperate dives, radios crackling with warnings of ambush. Hellcats were no longer just opponents, they were inescapable hunters, striking from above, then climbing out of reach. Aces who once boasted of victory now wrote of dread. Saburo Sakai, after escaping a Hellcat by luck, admitted, "For the first time, I felt hunted, not hunter." Morale eroded in the cockpit and on the ground. Junior pilots hesitated at the edge of battle, some refusing to fly without orders. The myth of the Zero had been replaced by a new legend, one of steel, discipline, and fear that could not be shaken even before a single shot was fired. June 19, 1944. Dawn over the Philippine Sea. Japanese carriers launch wave after wave, over 400 aircraft surging toward the American fleet. On the decks below, Combat Information Center operators track every blip on the radar screen, relaying vectors to waiting Hellcats. Within minutes, nearly 300 blue fighters roar into the sky, forming tight intercept patterns. Pilots cycle through the launch deck in 90-minute bursts, land, refuel, rearm, launch again, while deck crews hustle damaged planes below for frantic repairs. In the air, the battle unfolds with ruthless precision. Hellcat squadrons, guided by real-time radar and radio commands, slice into the incoming formations. Zeros and Judies tumble from the sky in droves. Gun camera reels and deck logs tally the carnage. By nightfall, over 300 Japanese aircraft are gone, their pilots lost or drifting. Only a handful of Hellcats fail to return. On the carrier bridges, officers study the radar plots: coordinated defense, unbroken discipline, a new kind of victory. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot isn't just a massacre. It's a demonstration of doctrine, teamwork, and overwhelming force, all orchestrated from CYC consoles and carrier decks. Inside the Imperial Japanese Navy's training halls, the numbers told a story of decline that no amount of courage could reverse. By 1945, new pilots arrived at the front with barely 40 hours in the cockpit, down from more than 700 just 3 years earlier. Staff manuals still demanded mastery of the turning duel, but the reality in the air was far different. Veteran instructors had vanished, lost to attrition and exhaustion, leaving raw recruits to face Hellcats with little more than rote drills and fading doctrine. Combat records from the final campaigns show that for every Zero lost, there was rarely a replacement who could survive even a single sortie. The kill-to-loss ratio, once a point of pride, now read like a death sentence, 19-1 in the enemy's favor. Orders still praised honor and individual valor, yet the system behind those words was hollow. Rigid tactics, unchanged since the war's start, left squadrons unable to adapt to coordinated American attacks. The result was not just defeat in the air, but the collapse of a tradition. The era of the lone samurai was over, sealed by numbers that no amount of bravery could change. 5,223. No other Allied fighter in the Pacific could claim a tally like that. The Hellcat's official victory count, drawn from US Navy combat records, stands as the single most decisive air-to-air record in World War II. For every Hellcat lost in aerial combat, more than 19 enemy planes fell. An unmatched kill-to-loss ratio that left statisticians searching for precedent. Squadrons flying off Essex and Enterprise logged mission after mission where entire Japanese formations vanished, sometimes without a single Hellcat shot down. In the final accounting, 3 out of every 4 US Navy air victories bore the Hellcat's name. Pilots credited their survival not just to armor or firepower, but to a machine that could be flown hard, fixed fast, and launched again before the enemy regrouped. The numbers were more than propaganda. They were confirmed by post-war analysis on both sides. In the air, on the decks, and in the ledgers, the Hellcat's record rewrote the meaning of air superiority. Long after the last Hellcat touched down, its design DNA carried forward, shaping the future of naval aviation. Grumman's next leap, the F8F Bearcat, took the Hellcat's philosophy and refined it for a new era. Lighter, even more agile, but still armored and pilot-focused, the Bearcat could climb faster than any piston fighter before it. Test flights in 1945 clocked the Bearcat's climb rate at over 4,500 feet per minute, a figure that left earlier Navy fighters in the dust. Every lesson from the Pacific, survivability, ease of maintenance, raw power, was built into each rivet and control surface. Decades later, the same ethos shaped the F/A-18 Hornet. Engineers studied wartime maintenance logs and pilot feedback, prioritizing systems that could be quickly repaired at sea and cockpits that kept pilots fighting, not fumbling with controls. The Hornet's twin engines, digital avionics, and rugged frame echo the Hellcat's mission-first approach. In the Navy's own design archives, memos from the 1940s still guided decisions: protect the pilot, simplify repairs, and build for the chaos of combat. The Hellcat's legacy endures, not just in museum halls, but in every modern jet that puts the pilot at the center of the fight. By war's end, the F6F Hellcat claimed 5,223 aerial victories, more than any other Allied naval fighter during World War II, while disciplined tactics like the Thach Weave shattered the Zero's reputation. The evidence leaves no doubt. Through engineering and doctrine, the Hellcat not only defeated the Zero in the air, it rewrote the rules of aerial warfare.